She tried to hide the injury. The Mafia boss noticed and took an unexpected action. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden hue over the bustling city. In one of the most luxurious restaurants in New York, hidden behind its marble pillars and crystal chandeliers, a young woman worked tirelessly to meet the needs of her high-end clientele. Her name was Isabella, and though she appeared poised and graceful, she was hiding a secret. As she moved from table to table, serving dishes and pouring wine, a sharp pain shot through her right wrist. She winced slightly but quickly composed herself, ensuring that no one around her noticed. It was just a small injury, she told herself. Nothing serious. She had learned long ago to push through the pain, to be invisible and efficient. But this time, the pain was different. The weight of the silver trays she carried seemed unbearable, and the delicate wine glasses wobbled slightly in her hands as she walked. She glanced down at her wrist, where a thin red line of blood had begun to seep through the sleeve of her uniform. She had been cut while cleaning earlier, but in her rush to keep up with the demanding customers, she had ignored the injury, hoping it would heal on its own. But now, with every step, the pain intensified. Isabella paused near the kitchen, her back to the wall, as she tried to steady her breath. She could feel the sweat on her forehead, her palms clammy with the weight of the trays. She forced a smile as she saw her next table, a group of wealthy businessmen laughing loudly. As she approached, she tried to hide the injury, covering her wrist with the hem of her sleeve. But she was not as discreet as she thought. In the far corner of the room, seated at a table near the window, sat Antonio Romano, the notorious Mafia boss known for his sharp suits and sharper instincts. Antonio had been observing Isabella ever since she walked past his table earlier that evening. He noticed the subtle way she held her wrist, the slight tremor in her hands. His eyes followed her every move, but he did not make his presence known. Isabella walked to the table with her usual grace, smiling brightly as she greeted the men. But as she poured the wine, her hand faltered for a moment, the glass tilting slightly as she struggled to control the pain. Antonio's gaze shifted, his sharp eyes narrowing as he saw the faint tremble in her fingers. He had seen this before. People trying to hide their injuries, trying to mask their vulnerability. It intrigued him. He was not one to tolerate weakness, but something about Isabella's quiet suffering caught his attention. He had worked hard to build his empire, to maintain control over every situation, every person, but this woman, this waitress, made him question that control. He watched her as she moved away, then turned to his men, giving a subtle nod. His instincts told him something was wrong. Antonio waited for a moment, observing, before he decided to act. It wasn't often that he took interest in the people who worked for him, but Isabella was different. There was something about her that piqued his curiosity. He excused himself from the table, his heavy footsteps echoing in the quiet of the restaurant. He moved with purpose, his presence commanding attention as he approached Isabella in the corner. She didn't notice him at first, her focus on gathering the wine glasses, but when she turned, their eyes met. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Isabella's heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat as she realized who stood before her. Antonio Romano, the man whose reputation preceded him in every dark corner of the city. She straightened quickly, instinctively, as her mind raced for words. But before she could speak, Antonio's voice, low and smooth, cut through the tension. "You're hurt," he said, his tone softer than she expected. Isabella's eyes widened in surprise. She tried to hide it again, to smile and deflect, but Antonio wasn't having it. "Let me see it," he commanded. His words were not a suggestion, they were a demand. Isabella hesitated, looking down at her wrist, her hand still clenched to her side. She had spent her entire life learning to avoid attention, to remain unseen, but here was this powerful man, forcing her to acknowledge her pain. Reluctantly, she held out her wrist. Antonio took a step closer, inspecting the injury with a keen eye. His jaw tightened, and for the briefest moment, Isabella saw something unfamiliar flicker in his eyes. Concern, perhaps? Or was it something deeper? You're not going back to work until this is taken care of, Antonio said firmly. Isabella's mouth went dry. She didn't know how to respond. Not to this man. Not to the world he represented. She had been in pain for hours, but never had she expected someone to notice, let alone take action. Antonio reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, making a quick call. Get a medic up here, he instructed, his voice now carrying an edge of authority that brooked no argument. And bring her to my office when you're done. Isabella wanted to protest, to tell him it was unnecessary, but the words caught in her throat. She had always been the one to push through, to endure without complaint. But now, standing before Antonio, she realized that this was different. He was not the man she had imagined, a ruthless, untouchable figure. There was something more to him, something unexpected. And just like that, in one moment, her entire world shifted. As Isabella stood there, her wrist still in Antonio's hand, she could hardly believe what was happening. The powerful mafia boss who controlled so much of New York's underground had just noticed her injury. And instead of ignoring it, as most people would, he was taking action. His command to call a medic and take her to his office was unexpected, and it left her feeling more confused than ever. She had lived her life fighting to stay unnoticed, but here she was, the center of his attention. When the medic arrived, Isabella was led to a private room away from the busy restaurant. Antonio's presence was like a shadow, silent and looming as he stood by, watching with an intensity she couldn't quite place. The medic examined her wrist carefully, cleaning the cut before applying a bandage. Isabella winced as the antiseptic stung, but she said nothing. She didn't want to appear weak, not in front of Antonio. The medic finished his work quickly, nodding to Antonio. It's not too serious, just a small cut. She should rest it for a while, the medic said before leaving the room, leaving Isabella alone with the mafia boss. Antonio moved toward her then, his movements deliberate and calm. How does it feel now? He asked, his voice low, his gaze unwavering. Isabella nodded, though her throat felt tight. Better, she managed to say, even though it still hurt. She was grateful for his concern, but she wasn't sure how to respond to it. She had spent her life hiding injuries, both physical and emotional, and now she found herself in a situation where someone was actually paying attention. It was a strange feeling. Antonio didn't seem to be in a hurry. He pulled up a chair and sat down across from her. You know, I don't usually get involved in matters like this, he said, breaking the silence that had settled between them. But something about you. He trailed off, as though trying to find the right words. Isabella couldn't understand why he was so interested in her. She was just another waitress, just another worker in the sea of people who serve the powerful. But there was something about him that made her want to believe that there was more to him than the rumors she had heard. She looked up at him, meeting his gaze for the first time without the wall she usually put up. I didn't ask for your help, she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. Antonio leaned back in his chair, studying her for a long moment. You didn't have to, he replied, his voice softer than before. But sometimes people need help, even when they don't ask for it. Isabella didn't know how to respond to that. She wasn't used to being cared for, let alone by someone like Antonio. She had heard the stories about him, the ruthless mafia boss who didn't hesitate to take control, to get what he wanted, no matter the cost. But here, in this room, he seemed different. For the first time in a long while, Isabella felt a sense of warmth from someone, even though she couldn't understand why he was doing it. The silence stretched on, but it wasn't uncomfortable. There was something in the air between them, something unspoken that Isabella couldn't quite grasp. Antonio finally broke the silence, his voice now filled with a quiet intensity. You're a hard worker, he said. I've been watching you. You don't let anything stop you, even when you're in pain. Isabella swallowed, unsure of what to say. She had always prided herself on her strength, her ability to push through anything. But hearing those words from Antonio, someone who had the power to control so much of her life, made her feel exposed in a way she hadn't expected. I'm used to it, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't have a choice. Antonio stood up, moving toward the door. He paused before leaving, his hand resting on the doorknob. You have a choice, he said, his tone unexpectedly kind. You don't have to keep doing everything on your own. Isabella blinked in surprise. She had never thought of it that way. She had always believed that if she didn't take care of things herself, no one would. But now, with Antonio standing in front of her, offering something that felt like a lifeline, she wasn't so sure. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice filled with a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. Antonio nodded, his expression unreadable. "You'll be all right," he said. "Just take it easy for a while. Rest your hand. You've earned it." With that, he turned and left, leaving Isabella alone in the room. She sat there for a long time, staring at the door, her mind racing. What had just happened? Why had Antonio taken such an interest in her? She didn't know the answers, but one thing was clear. Her life was about to change. She could feel it in the air, a shift that she couldn't quite explain. And despite the uncertainty, a small part of her felt relieved. For the first time in years, she wasn't alone. Antonio's unexpected kindness had cracked through the walls she had so carefully built around herself. It was a feeling she wasn't sure how to handle, but it was also a feeling she couldn't deny. Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The moment Antonio had left the room, leaving her with nothing but the warmth of his words and the surprising tenderness of his actions, she felt a mixture of gratitude and confusion. She had spent years fighting to stay invisible, to go unnoticed in the chaos of life. But in that brief exchange, Antonio had done the one thing she didn't expect. He had truly seen her. She sat quietly in the room, her wrists still throbbing softly beneath the bandage, the soft glow of the restaurant lights filtering through the curtains. It felt as though the weight of the world had been lifted, just a little, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to breathe. But her thoughts kept circling back to him, Antonio Romano. The Mafia boss with the sharp suits and the cold, intimidating presence. The same man whose empire was built on power, fear, and control. Why had he helped her? What was his real motive? Isabella didn't know. But for the first time in her life, she was afraid of finding out. She shook her head, trying to clear her mind. She had a job to do. She couldn't afford to dwell on thoughts that could distract her. Still, she couldn't ignore the fact that Antonio had done something no one else ever had. He had seen her, truly seen her, in a way that felt human. A knock on the door broke her reverie. She looked up, startled, and quickly stood up, adjusting her uniform. "Come in," she called softly, her voice betraying a hint of nervousness. The door creaked open, and in stepped one of Antonio's bodyguards. His presence was imposing, but there was no threat in his eyes. "Mr. Romano asked me to check on you," he said, his voice gruff yet respectful. "He wants to make sure you're all right." Isabella blinked, her breath catching in her throat. She had been expecting him to forget about her, or at least let her be. But here was this bodyguard, delivering a message that felt like an echo of something more significant. "I'm fine," she said quickly, still trying to gather her thoughts. "Just a little pain, but nothing serious." The bodyguard nodded, his expression unreadable. "He also wanted me to bring you something," he continued, holding out a small package wrapped in dark velvet. Isabella hesitated for a moment before taking it, her fingers brushing against the soft fabric. She hadn't expected a gift, let alone something so luxurious. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The bodyguard nodded once and turned to leave. "Mr. Romano said you should rest. He's made arrangements for you." Before Isabella could ask what he meant, the bodyguard was gone, the door clicking shut behind him. She stood there, staring at the package in her hands. The weight of it seemed heavy, almost too much to bear. She hadn't been expecting any of this. She was just a waitress, just someone who worked hard to make ends meet. And yet, here she was, standing in a private room, receiving something from the most powerful man in the city. She slowly unwrapped the package, revealing a set of elegant shoes, polished leather, perfect for the formal attire she was required to wear. But what surprised her even more was the note tucked inside the box. "For you. Don't ignore yourself again. You deserve more." The words were simple, but they struck her deeply. Antonio Romano, the man who could control an entire city, was telling her to take care of herself. He was telling her that she mattered. Isabella swallowed hard, trying to steady the rush of emotions that were threatening to overwhelm her. She had never allowed herself to believe she deserved anything. She had always told herself that survival was enough, that getting by was all that mattered. But here was someone telling her otherwise. Antonio didn't just see her as a worker, as someone who could be used and discarded. He saw her as someone worthy of care. It felt like a revelation, a truth she had never allowed herself to believe. She glanced at the clock, realizing that it was time for her shift to begin again. The rest of the night loomed ahead of her, a blur of movements, orders, and polite smiles. But as she stood there, holding the shoes and the note, she realized something had changed. She no longer felt invisible. For the first time in years, she felt as though she mattered to someone, not because of what she could do for them, but simply because she existed. Antonio's actions were small, almost insignificant in the grand scheme of things. But to her, they meant everything. She slipped on the shoes, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over her. She wasn't sure what Antonio wanted from her, or why he was being kind to her. But for now, it didn't matter. What mattered was that she wasn't alone. And that, in itself, was enough to give her hope. Isabella's mind raced as she stood there, still holding the shoes in her hands. Antonio's unexpected kindness had left her speechless. She wasn't sure what to think or what to do next. She had always prided herself on being self-sufficient, on never needing anyone's help. Yet, in the last few days, she had been shown a side of life she wasn't sure she was ready for. The warmth from Antonio's actions contrasted sharply with the cold, hardened world she had known. She had never imagined that someone like him, someone with so much power, someone feared and respected, could show such care, such genuine concern for her well-being. It was a kindness that felt both foreign and deeply comforting. Isabella knew she couldn't afford to get caught up in it, not when her life had always been about staying focused, staying invisible. Yet the thought lingered in her mind, like a soft whisper she couldn't shake. As the days passed, Isabella found herself growing more and more accustomed to Antonio's presence. He would stop by the restaurant from time to time, and when he did, his gaze would always find hers. She had never been one for attention, but when he looked at her, it was as though the rest of the world disappeared. It wasn't just about the way he noticed her, it was the way he cared, the way he saw beyond the surface. She could see it in his eyes, in the quiet moments they shared when no one else was looking. It wasn't just the shoes or the note he had left for her. It was something deeper. He had seen her struggle, seen the quiet pain she carried, and in a way, he had given her permission to let go of the walls she had built. Still, Isabella couldn't help but feel a twinge of hesitation. She had always been the one to take care of herself. The idea of relying on someone else, even someone like Antonio, felt uncomfortable. She was not used to the idea of being vulnerable, of letting someone else take care of her. But as the days wore on, she couldn't deny the shift that had taken place inside her. It was subtle at first, like a crack in a wall she had built over the years, but it was there. The more Antonio noticed her, the more she found herself feeling human. That evening, as Isabella finished her shift, she found herself standing by the kitchen door, waiting for the rest of the staff to leave. The restaurant had quieted down, and she felt the weight of the long day pressing on her shoulders. She was tired, but there was something she had to do. As she stood there, lost in her thoughts, the sound of footsteps approached. She turned to see Antonio walking toward her, his usual confident stride bringing an air of authority with it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Antonio simply stopped in front of her, his dark eyes searching her face. Isabella felt a flutter in her chest, but she didn't look away. She had grown used to his presence, to the way he made her feel seen. "You're still here," Antonio said softly, his voice warm, almost concerned. Isabella nodded, trying to muster a smile. "Just finishing up," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. There was an awkward silence between them for a moment before Antonio spoke again. "You've been working hard," he said. "Too hard." Isabella's heart skipped a beat. She had heard that tone in his voice before, the one that carried both authority and concern. She wasn't sure how to respond. "I'm fine," she said quickly, her usual deflection. "Just doing my job." Antonio shook his head slightly, the faintest smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You don't have to do it all alone, you know." His words were simple, but they carried weight. For a moment, Isabella was at a loss for words. She had always prided herself on her independence, on being able to take care of everything on her own. But there was something in Antonio's words that made her feel as though she didn't have to carry the weight of the world by herself anymore. It was a strange feeling, one that made her feel both lighter and more vulnerable. "I don't want to be a burden," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Antonio's gaze softened as he took a step closer. "You're not a burden," he said firmly. "You're a person, and people deserve to be taken care of." Isabella looked down at her hands, her mind racing. She had never allowed herself to think this way. She had always kept her head down, done the work, and never asked for anything in return. But Antonio's words, his kindness, were slowly starting to break down the walls she had spent so many years building. "You don't owe me anything," she said, her voice catching slightly. Antonio stepped forward, gently lifting her chin so that she was forced to meet his gaze. "I don't need to owe you anything," he said, his voice low but filled with conviction. "I want to help, and you deserve it." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Isabella's heart beat a little faster, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe them. "Thank you," she whispered, the gratitude in her voice surprising even herself. Antonio nodded, his expression softening. "Just take care of yourself," he said. "That's all I ask." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Isabella standing there, her mind racing with thoughts she wasn't sure how to process. But one thing was clear: Antonio had changed something in her. Something she wasn't ready to face, but something she couldn't ignore. For the first time, she felt seen. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe she was worth something more than just surviving. Isabella stood in the quiet of the restaurant after closing, her mind still spinning from the events of the evening. Antonio's words echoed in her head, and she could hardly process what was happening in her life. For the first time, someone had cared for her in a way that wasn't transactional, that wasn't tied to her ability to work or serve. Antonio had seen her, truly seen her, and had done something so unexpected it made her heart ache. She glanced at the shoes he had given her, now neatly placed beside her. They were more than just an elegant pair of shoes. They symbolized something she never thought she would receive: care, compassion, and respect. It had been a long time since she had felt like she deserved any of those things. She had always kept her head down, doing the work, surviving. But now, she was questioning everything. Antonio hadn't just given her shoes. He had given her a glimpse of a life where she wasn't just a cog in the machine. She wasn't just a maid or a waitress. She was a person with value, with worth beyond what she could do for others. She didn't know how to react to that. She had spent so long protecting herself from others, building walls to keep the world at arm's length. But here was Antonio, the most powerful man she had ever met, showing her something different. It wasn't just kindness. It was something that made her feel human again. She took a deep breath and walked toward the kitchen to finish cleaning up. She didn't want to stay in her thoughts for too long. Work had always been her escape, and she needed the rhythm of it to keep her mind occupied. As she wiped down the counter, her mind drifted back to Antonio. He had been watching her closely. She had felt his gaze on her ever since he stepped into the restaurant that first night. It was a gaze that didn't judge, didn't belittle. It was a gaze that acknowledged her as someone more than just a servant. She knew she couldn't ignore the feelings stirring inside her, but she also knew she couldn't afford to get too attached. Antonio was a mafia boss. His world was dangerous, unpredictable, and full of consequences. She couldn't afford to get involved in that world. But every time she thought about walking away from it, a part of her resisted. Maybe it was because, for the first time, she felt like someone cared about her well-being. Maybe it was because she had spent so many years feeling invisible, and now she was being seen. She shook her head and finished cleaning up, trying to push her thoughts aside. She needed to focus on the reality of her situation. But as she was about to leave for the night, the door to the kitchen opened, and Antonio walked in. He didn't look like the ruthless mafia boss everyone feared. In that moment, he looked like something else entirely. Human, vulnerable, and deeply sincere. "You're still here," he said softly, his gaze locking onto hers. Isabella blinked, startled by his presence. "Just finishing up," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She was surprised by how calm she felt around him, how easy it was to talk to him, even when she was so used to keeping her distance. "You don't have to do everything alone, you know," Antonio said, his voice filled with that same quiet concern. Isabella felt a lump form in her throat. She had heard the words before, from others who had meant well, but hearing them from him felt different. He wasn't just offering words of comfort. He was offering something much more precious: his time, his attention, his care. "I don't know what to do with that," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. I've spent so long taking care of myself. I don't know how to let anyone in. Antonio stepped closer, his expression softening. You don't have to do it all alone, he said again. I'm here. Isabella looked up at him, her heart racing. She wasn't sure if it was fear or something else that was making her pulse quicken. She had spent her entire life being self-sufficient, pushing away any notion that she could rely on others. But Antonio's words were slowly breaking down the walls she had so carefully built. I don't know how to trust people, she said, her voice barely audible. Antonio's eyes softened, and he reached out to gently lift her chin, guiding her gaze back to him. I'm not asking you to trust everyone, he said, his voice low and steady. Just trust me, just for a moment. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the genuine care that seemed to radiate from him. It was overwhelming, and for a brief second, she allowed herself to believe it. She allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to carry the weight of the world alone. Antonio stepped back and nodded toward the door. Go home, he said. Get some rest. You've earned it. Isabella hesitated. But what about you? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Antonio smiled, but it wasn't the cold, calculating smile she had come to associate with him. This one was warm, comforting, and filled with something she couldn't quite name. I'll be fine, he said softly. I always am. As she left the restaurant that night, the weight in her chest felt lighter. She had no idea what the future held, or where this strange connection with Antonio might lead, but for the first time in a long while, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Hope that maybe there was more to life than just surviving. Hope that maybe she deserved something more. And for the first time, Isabella allowed herself to believe that things could change. That she could change. Isabella walked slowly through the quiet streets, the cool night air brushing against her skin. The events of the evening replayed in her mind, each moment with Antonio lingering in her thoughts. She had never felt so seen, so understood. His kindness, his insistence that she take care of herself, felt like something from another world. The world she had known, the world where survival was everything, was crumbling in the face of something she didn't know how to handle. She reached her small apartment, the familiar creak of the door greeting her as she entered. The space was modest, but it had been hers, a small sanctuary away from the hustle of the world. She set the shoes Antonio had given her carefully by the door, the velvet note still tucked inside. The note's words, "You deserve more," echoed in her mind. She hadn't let herself think about those words for too long. She was afraid of what they might mean. As she sat down on her bed, her eyes fell on the shoes again. They were beautiful, far more luxurious than anything she had ever owned. A part of her wanted to set them aside, to forget about them, because they reminded her of a world that wasn't hers. But another part of her, a part she hadn't listened to in a long time, wanted to believe in them. She wanted to believe that someone like Antonio, with his power and influence, could care enough to give her something more than just a passing glance. Isabella ran her fingers over the smooth leather, the feel of it grounding her. She knew she had to work, had to keep moving forward. She couldn't afford to stop and think about things she didn't understand. But there was something stirring inside her, something that made her wonder if there could be more to life than just surviving. The next day, Isabella returned to work, her mind still occupied with thoughts of Antonio. She tried to push them aside, focusing on the tasks at hand, the endless stream of orders, the demands of the customers. But every time she walked past Antonio's usual spot in the restaurant, she could feel his eyes on her. It wasn't a look of judgment or ownership, as she had expected. It was a look that made her feel valued, and it made her uncomfortable. She didn't know how to navigate this new feeling, this feeling of being cared for without strings attached. The day passed slowly, the hours dragging on as she tried to keep herself busy. She tried to ignore the flutter in her chest every time Antonio's gaze met hers, but it was becoming harder and harder to do. As the night wore on, Antonio arrived at the restaurant. As usual, his presence commanding attention. Isabella tried to keep her distance, focused on her work, but she couldn't help the way her heart skipped a beat when he walked in. There was something about him, something that drew her in. He wasn't like anyone she had ever met before. He was powerful, yes, but he was also kind. And that was a combination that was impossible to ignore. As the night went on, Antonio's gaze seemed to linger on her more than usual. She couldn't escape the feeling that he was waiting for something, Or perhaps he was just watching her. When her shift ended, she was surprised to find him standing by the door, waiting for her. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. It wasn't necessary. There was an understanding between them now, something unspoken that neither of them needed to put into words. "Are you finished?" he asked softly, his voice warm, the usual cold edge absent. Isabella nodded, feeling a wave of nervousness wash over her. "Yes, just about to leave." Antonio smiled, a small but genuine smile that made her heart flutter. "Good. I was hoping we could talk for a minute." Isabella hesitated, uncertain of what to say. She wasn't used to being asked for her time, let alone by someone like Antonio. But there was something in his tone that made her feel safe, something that made her want to stay. "Of course," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Antonio led her outside, the cool night air greeting them as they stepped into the quiet street. He didn't speak immediately, giving her time to adjust. They walked side by side, the silence between them comfortable, but still heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Antonio spoke, his voice low. "You've been working hard," he said, his tone filled with something that could almost be described as concern. Isabella glanced up at him, her heart pounding in her chest. "I'm used to it," she said quickly, wanting to brush off his words. But Antonio didn't let her. "That's not the point," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "The point is that you deserve more. You deserve better than this." Isabella stopped walking, her breath catching in her throat. "I don't understand," she said softly. "What do you mean?" Antonio turned to face her, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her heart race. "You don't have to keep pushing yourself like this," he said, his voice steady. "You don't have to do it alone anymore." Isabella felt her chest tighten, the weight of his words settling heavily on her. She had spent so long believing she could only rely on herself, that anyone else was a luxury she couldn't afford. But Antonio was offering her something different. He was offering her a chance to let go of the burden she had carried for so long. "I've never had anyone like you offer me anything," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I don't know what to do with it." Antonio reached out, gently touching her arm. "You don't have to do anything right now," he said. "Just know that you don't have to do it all alone. Not anymore." Isabella looked up at him, her heart racing. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that there was more to life than just surviving. Antonio had shown her that, in a world full of cold, calculating people, kindness still had the power to change everything. And for the first time in her life, Isabella allowed herself to think that maybe, just maybe, she deserved it. Isabella couldn't shake the feeling of uncertainty as she walked through the empty streets, the weight of Antonio's words lingering in her mind. She had never expected anything like this, never expected someone like him, so powerful and detached from the world she knew, to show such care and concern. But now that it had happened, she couldn't ignore the shift it had caused in her. She had always kept herself at arm's length from others, hiding behind a wall of self-reliance. But Antonio's presence, his insistence that she didn't have to carry her burdens alone, was breaking down that wall piece by piece. She wasn't sure how to process it. The next few days passed in a blur. Antonio's presence at the restaurant became a routine, though Isabella's interaction with him remained minimal. He would come in, sit at his usual spot, and watch her from across the room. His gaze was always steady, almost as though he was waiting for something, waiting for her to make the next move. But Isabella wasn't ready for that. She wasn't ready to open up to him, to let herself be vulnerable in a way she never had before. She spent her days lost in her work, focusing on the tasks at hand and trying to push aside the swirling thoughts in her head. But at night, when she was alone in her apartment, she found herself thinking about Antonio more and more. She had never felt like this before, like someone truly cared, not for what she could do for them, but for her as a person. And it scared her. But that night, as she finished her shift, something unexpected happened. Antonio was waiting for her again, just outside the restaurant, his imposing figure a stark contrast to the quiet streets around them. He was standing under the dim light, looking like he had been expecting her. Isabella felt her pulse quicken, her nerves on edge. She had tried to push him out of her mind, tried to keep her distance, but here he was, standing before her again. "You're leaving late tonight," Antonio said, his voice smooth, almost like a calm presence in the middle of her swirling thoughts. Isabella nodded, unsure of how to respond. Yeah, just finishing up. He took a step closer, his eyes not leaving hers. You're working too hard, he said. You don't have to keep doing this alone, you know. His words caught her off guard. She had heard them before, but this time they felt different. There was something behind them, something more than just concern. I'm fine, Isabella replied quickly, trying to hide the vulnerability she felt creeping up. But Antonio wasn't convinced. I've been watching you, he said, his voice lowering slightly. You don't have to pretend you're fine with me. You don't need to keep up the facade. Isabella swallowed hard, her chest tightening. She had spent so long building walls, hiding her true self from everyone. But here was Antonio, tearing them down one by one. I don't know how to stop pretending, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I've always had to do it all myself. Antonio stepped closer, his gaze softening as he reached out, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. You don't have to do it all, he said firmly. Not anymore. For a moment, there was a silence between them, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Isabella could feel the walls inside her slowly crumbling, the layers of self-protection she had built over the years starting to fall away. She wasn't sure if she was ready to let go of everything she had known, but standing here, in front of Antonio, she couldn't deny the pull she felt toward him. What do you want from me? She asked, her voice shaky. Antonio tilted his head slightly, studying her with an intensity that made her heart race. I don't want anything, he said, his voice low and sincere. I just want to see you stop carrying the world on your shoulders. I want you to know that you don't have to do this alone. Isabella felt a tear slip down her cheek before she could stop it. She quickly wiped it away, embarrassed by the emotion she couldn't control. But Antonio didn't seem to mind. He stood there, offering her something she hadn't even known she needed, a chance to finally rest, to let someone else care for her. You don't have to be strong all the time, he continued. It's okay to let someone else carry the weight for a while. Isabella's breath caught in her throat as she realized just how much she had been holding in. All these years, she had told herself she didn't need anyone, that she could survive on her own. But now, standing before Antonio, she was starting to believe that maybe she didn't have to. Maybe it was okay to let someone else in. I don't know how to do this, she admitted, her voice trembling. How to let someone help me? Antonio's expression softened even further. You don't have to know how, he said gently. Just take it one step at a time. You're not alone in this. Isabella looked up at him, her heart pounding in her chest. There was something in his gaze, something that made her believe him. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of the world lifting, just a little. She wasn't sure where this path with Antonio would lead, but for the first time, she allowed herself to believe it could be something different. Something better. Thank you, she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. Antonio smiled, a soft, genuine smile that reached his eyes. You don't need to thank me, he said quietly. Just take care of yourself. That's all that matters. As he turned to leave, Isabella stood there, feeling something inside her shift. She had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like it could be something worth living for. Isabella woke the next morning with a strange sense of calm, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. The events of the previous night still lingered in her mind. Antonio's words, his kindness, his insistence that she let go of the weight she had carried alone for so long. She wasn't sure what it all meant, but something inside her had shifted. She spent the day moving through her usual routine, trying to keep her thoughts at bay. The restaurant was busy, but her mind kept drifting back to Antonio and their conversation. She couldn't quite place what was happening between them, but it felt like the start of something she wasn't ready for, something that could change everything. That evening, as she finished her shift, she was surprised to find him waiting for her again. This time, he wasn't just standing near the door. He was leaning casually against a pillar, his eyes following her as she approached. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to act. The way he looked at her made her feel like she was under a microscope. You're late tonight, he said, his voice smooth but with a hint of something softer. Isabella smiled faintly, shrugging. It's been a long day. I know the feeling, Antonio replied. There was something in his tone that made her realize he wasn't just referring to the work. He understood what it was like to carry burdens, to keep moving even when everything inside of you wanted to stop. She felt a connection, something unspoken, but very real. I've been thinking, Antonio said, his voice drawing her attention back to him. You don't have to keep pretending everything is fine. Isabella's heart skipped a beat. She had spent years perfecting the art of hiding her struggles, of pretending she was strong when inside she was breaking. But Antonio saw through that. She didn't know how he did it, but he saw her. And in his eyes, she didn't feel weak. She didn't feel like she had to hide. I'm not pretending, she said softly, but the words sounded empty, even to her. Antonio stepped forward, his presence filling the space between them. You don't have to do it alone, he said, his voice so gentle it almost felt like a command. You deserve more than this. Isabella shook her head slightly, unsure of what to say. She had never let anyone in. She had never allowed anyone to see the vulnerability she kept locked away. But Antonio wasn't just anyone. I don't know how to stop pretending, she admitted quietly, her voice breaking with emotion she had kept buried for so long. Antonio's gaze softened, and he reached out, gently cupping her cheek. The warmth of his hand sent a ripple of comfort through her. You don't need to know how, he said, his voice steady, full of conviction. You just need to let go. Let me help. His words were simple, yet they felt like the weight of the world was being lifted off her shoulders. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was carrying everything alone. She had always been the one to pick herself up, to keep going no matter what. But now, standing in front of Antonio, she realized she didn't have to do it alone anymore. Why are you doing this? Isabella asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Antonio's expression softened, a rare tenderness crossing his features. Because you matter, he said simply. And you don't have to go through life alone. Isabella felt a tear slip down her cheek, but this time it wasn't from pain. It was from something else, something she had never allowed herself to feel before. She reached up, gently touching his hand, her fingers trembling as she did. I don't know how to trust anyone, she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. I've spent my whole life not trusting anyone. How do I let you in? Antonio looked at her with such intensity, such quiet strength, that for a moment, she almost forgot how to breathe. Trust is something you don't have to figure out all at once, he said softly. You just have to take it one step at a time. Let me show you how to trust again. Isabella swallowed hard, the emotions building up inside her. She wasn't used to this, wasn't used to someone offering her so much care, so much kindness. It felt overwhelming, but at the same time, it felt right. I'm scared, she whispered, the vulnerability in her voice almost foreign to her. Antonio's eyes softened even further, and he stepped closer. I know you are, he said gently. But you don't have to be. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. She felt the weight of his words settle deep in her chest, like a promise. For the first time in years, she didn't feel so alone. She wasn't sure where this would lead. She wasn't sure what the future held. But standing there, in front of Antonio, she knew one thing for certain. She didn't have to carry the weight of the world by herself anymore. Antonio had given her something she hadn't allowed herself to believe she deserved. Hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, she was worth something more than just surviving. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe it. She stepped closer to him, the gap between them closing as if it had always been meant to be. And for the first time, she allowed herself to trust him, to trust that she didn't have to face the world alone anymore. Isabella found herself standing on the edge of something she didn't fully understand, something she wasn't sure she was ready for. Antonio's presence in her life had shifted everything, and she couldn't deny the way he made her feel, seen, cared for, like she mattered. But the truth was, she didn't know how to handle it. She had spent years living in survival mode, keeping her emotions in check, making sure no one could see her vulnerabilities. Now, Antonio had not only seen them, he had welcomed them. It made her nervous. She had no idea how to navigate this new reality. She had no experience with someone who cared without expecting something in return. As the days passed, she couldn't ignore the way things had changed between them. She could feel the tension growing, but it wasn't the kind of tension that made her afraid. It was the kind of tension that made her heart race, that made her wonder if something deeper was blossoming between them. The restaurant was busier than usual that evening, but even in the chaos, Isabella couldn't help but notice when Antonio walked in. His usual spot was waiting for him, but he didn't sit down right away. Instead, he glanced around the room until his eyes found hers. That steady, unwavering gaze made her heart skip a beat. For a moment, She wasn't sure if she could keep her composure. But she did. She had learned to keep things in check, to stay focused on the task at hand. But as the night wore on, she found herself looking for him, stealing glances whenever she could. Antonio had a way of making her feel like she was the only one in the room, like everything else faded into the background when their eyes met. She couldn't deny the pull she felt toward him. It was magnetic, undeniable. After her shift ended, she felt a mix of anticipation and uncertainty as she walked toward the back exit. She wasn't sure what would happen next. She wasn't sure if she was ready for whatever this was. But she couldn't ignore the pull, the desire to know him better, to explore this strange connection between them. As she stepped outside, she saw him standing there, waiting for her. The cool night air made her shiver slightly, but the warmth of his presence was enough to calm her nerves. "You're done for the night?" he asked, his voice soft but commanding, just like always. Isabella nodded, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Yeah, just finishing up." He stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "I've been thinking," he said, his tone thoughtful. "You've been working hard. You don't have to do this all alone, you know." Isabella's breath caught in her throat. She had heard those words before, but hearing them from Antonio made them feel different. It wasn't just kindness. It was a promise, an invitation to something more. "I'm not sure how to stop," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Antonio reached out, his hand gently brushing against hers. "You don't have to stop everything at once," he said, his voice reassuring. "Just take it one step at a time." Isabella's heart pounded in her chest as she met his gaze. There was something in his eyes, something that made her feel like she was safe, like she didn't have to keep hiding. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to carry everything alone anymore. "What if I don't know how to trust?" she asked, her voice shaky. Antonio's smile was gentle, reassuring. "I'll be here," he said simply. "You don't have to do this alone. Not anymore." She didn't know what to say. She didn't know if she was ready to fully trust him, to let him in. But something in her heart told her that maybe it was time to stop running, to stop pretending. Maybe it was time to take a leap of faith. "I've never had anyone like you in my life," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "I don't know what to do with that." Antonio's expression softened even more. "You don't have to do anything, Isabella. Just let me be here for you." The sincerity in his voice, the warmth of his touch, made her heart swell with emotions she had long buried. For the first time in years, she felt like she didn't have to be strong all the time. She didn't have to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I'm scared of letting someone in. I don't know how to do it." Antonio cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing away a stray tear that had fallen down her cheek. "You don't have to be scared," he said softly. "You don't have to do anything but trust that you're not alone anymore." Isabella closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to feel the comfort of his words. She had spent so many years hiding, keeping everyone at arm's length. But with Antonio, she didn't feel the need to hide. He wasn't asking for anything in return. He wasn't expecting her to be perfect. He just wanted her to be herself. And for the first time, she was starting to believe that maybe that was enough. "I don't know what this is," Isabella said softly, her voice full of vulnerability. "But I want to find out." Antonio's eyes sparkled with something deeper, something that made her feel even more connected to him. "We'll take it one step at a time," he said, his voice gentle but full of promise. And for the first time, Isabella believed him. She believed that maybe, just maybe, she was worth something more than survival. She believed that she could trust again. And with Antonio by her side, she was starting to believe that she didn't have to face the world alone anymore. Isabella awoke the next morning feeling different. There was a weight lifted from her, not entirely gone, but certainly lighter than before. Antonio's words, his presence in her life, had opened something inside her that she had been holding shut for years. She had spent so long just surviving, never letting anyone close, never trusting, and certainly never allowing herself to believe she could be more than what her circumstances dictated. But now, she wasn't sure what to think. She had spent the last few days trying to process it, trying to figure out how to reconcile the person she had been with the one she was becoming. She had thought of him, Antonio, so many times. His kindness had been so unexpected, and as much as she tried to push it out of her mind, it lingered. The way he had offered her help, asked for nothing in return, the way he made her feel seen, as if she was more than just the job she did. It felt like a betrayal of everything she had ever known, yet it felt right. She wasn't sure she could go back to the way things were, to pretending to be fine when she wasn't. That evening, as she prepared to head to work, she realized something had changed. It wasn't just her thoughts or feelings, it was her attitude toward the life she had been living. She didn't want to survive anymore. She wanted to live. As she walked into the restaurant, she found herself looking for Antonio, but the moment she saw him, standing near the back, the familiar mix of excitement and nervousness surged through her. He was watching her with that steady, intense gaze, the one that seemed to strip away every layer of defense she had. His presence was magnetic, and for the first time, she didn't want to look away. As the evening progressed, Isabella found herself stealing glances at him, trying to catch his eye, wondering what he was thinking. He didn't speak to her at first, keeping his distance as he usually did, but there was something different in the air, something that made her feel like he was waiting for her to make the next move. She wasn't sure what to do. He had already done so much for her, more than anyone else had in her entire life. But the thought of accepting more from him made her feel exposed. But as the night wore on, the pull between them only grew stronger. And when her shift finally ended, she found him waiting for her by the back door again, just as he had the night before. This time, she didn't hesitate. She walked toward him, her heart pounding in her chest. He gave her a small smile as she approached. "You're done for the night?" he asked, his voice calm, yet filled with something else, something that made her feel like he cared more than just for her well-being in the moment. "Yeah," she said, a bit of uncertainty creeping into her voice. "It was a long day." "I can see that," he said, his gaze softening. "You've been working hard. You deserve a break." Isabella swallowed, unsure of how to respond. She wasn't used to being told she deserved anything. "I'm fine," she said quickly, trying to brush off his words. But Antonio wasn't having it. "You're not fine," he said firmly, stepping closer. "You've been carrying everything on your own for too long. It's okay to let go, to take a moment for yourself." Isabella's heart skipped a beat. She had always carried everything on her own, kept her head down, and worked until she couldn't anymore. Letting go, trusting someone else to help her, that had never been an option. But Antonio was offering her something different. He wasn't demanding anything from her. He wasn't asking for anything in return. He just wanted to help. "I don't know how to let go," Isabella said, her voice breaking slightly. "I've never known how to do that. I've spent my whole life pretending to be fine when I'm not." Antonio's expression softened, and for the first time, she saw something in him that she hadn't expected, a vulnerability, a quiet understanding. "You don't have to pretend anymore," he said gently. "Not with me." His words struck deep inside her, breaking down the walls she had spent so many years building. She felt a tear slip down her cheek before she could stop it, but it wasn't one of sorrow. It was one of release. A release of everything she had kept locked away for so long. "I'm scared," she whispered, the vulnerability in her voice more real than it had ever been. Antonio took a step closer, his presence comforting, steady. "I know you are," he said softly, his voice filled with warmth. "But you don't have to be. I'm here. You don't have to do this alone anymore." Isabella's breath caught in her throat as she looked up at him. The weight of his words, the sincerity in his eyes, made her feel something she hadn't felt in years: hope. She wasn't sure where this was leading, but for the first time in a long time, she was allowing herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she was worth more than just surviving. "I don't know if I can trust this," she said softly, her voice almost inaudible. "I don't know if I can trust you." Antonio smiled, a small, reassuring smile. "You don't have to trust everything right now," he said. "Just trust that you don't have to carry the world on your shoulders anymore. Let me help you." For the first time, Isabella allowed herself to believe in something other than survival. She didn't know what the future held, or what this connection with Antonio would mean, but she was ready to find out. Ready to let go of the life she had known and take a chance on something new. Something that was more than just surviving. Something that could be real. And as she looked into Antonio's eyes, she knew she wasn't alone anymore. As the days passed, Isabella found herself in a world she hadn't prepared for. Every time she saw Antonio, every time they spoke, she could feel herself falling deeper into something she wasn't sure she could control. He had given her space to breathe, to be herself in ways no one had ever allowed her. But with that freedom came fear. a fear that she didn't know how to navigate. She had spent so long building walls around her heart, walls so high that they had become a part of who she was. And now, Antonio had come along and effortlessly chipped away at them, piece by piece. But the question still lingered in her mind. Was she ready to let go? Was she ready to let him in completely? Antonio's presence in her life had changed everything. The woman who had once hidden in the shadows, who had kept to herself, to avoid pain, was now standing in the light, exposed and vulnerable. But there was a part of her that felt stronger than ever before, a part of her that wasn't afraid of the unknown. The evening after their last conversation, when she had admitted her fear of trusting him, Isabella found herself waiting for him again, unsure of what would come next. She had come to expect his presence, and yet, every time he was near, she felt a wave of uncertainty flood over her. She didn't want to admit it, but she knew that something inside her had shifted in the most unexpected way. Antonio had seen her, the real her, and accepted her, flaws and all. And that acceptance, that understanding, was both a gift and a challenge. That evening, as the restaurant grew quieter, Isabella was finishing her shift when she saw him enter, as calm and composed as ever. She wasn't surprised. He had a way of entering a room that commanded attention, but there was no arrogance in it, just an undeniable presence. She felt her heart race as he walked over to her, his eyes never leaving hers. "You're still here," he said, his voice soft yet full of meaning. Isabella couldn't help but smile, despite the nerves bubbling in her chest. "I have a few things to finish up," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Antonio nodded, his gaze gentle but intense. "You don't have to keep working so hard, Isabella," he said, his tone almost pleading. "You've done enough." His words made something inside her stir. She had always prided herself on her work ethic, on the idea that she had to keep going, keep pushing, even when she was exhausted. But with Antonio's words, it felt like he was asking her to stop, to breathe, to let someone else take over, to let someone else care for her. It was a foreign concept. She wasn't used to it. "I don't know how to stop," she said quietly, the vulnerability in her voice surprising even herself. Antonio stepped closer, his hand reaching out to gently touch her arm, a gesture that was soft but powerful. "You don't have to do everything yourself," he said softly. "I'm here." Isabella's chest tightened, her breath hitching as she looked up at him. She had never allowed herself to need anyone before, but with Antonio, everything was different. She could feel her walls crumbling, and part of her wanted to run, to hide, to put them back up. But another part of her, a part she hadn't let herself listen to in years, was ready to let go. "I don't know how to trust," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent so long thinking I had to do it all alone." Antonio's expression softened as he reached out, cupping her face in his hands. "You don't have to figure it all out at once," he said gently. "You don't have to know how to trust right now. Just know that I'm here, and you're not alone." Isabella's heart raced as she felt the warmth of his touch, the sincerity in his voice. She had been running from this for so long, but standing here in front of him, she didn't want to run anymore. She didn't want to hide behind the walls she had built around herself. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel the weight of the emotions she had been avoiding. "I'm scared," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know how to do this." Antonio smiled softly, a small, reassuring smile. "You don't have to do it alone," he repeated. "I'm here. You don't have to be scared." Isabella closed her eyes for a moment, taking in the warmth of his words. It was as though a dam inside her had cracked open, and for the first time, she allowed herself to feel vulnerable. She wasn't alone. Antonio wasn't just offering her protection. He was offering her something more, something she had never allowed herself to receive. The idea of trust, of letting someone in, was terrifying. But Antonio had shown her that maybe, just maybe, it was worth the risk. "I want to try," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I want to trust you." Antonio's eyes softened, and he gently kissed her forehead. "You don't have to try alone," he said. "I'll be here every step of the way." Isabella's heart swelled with emotions she didn't know how to handle. But for the first time, she didn't feel afraid. She didn't feel like she was on the edge of a precipice, ready to fall. Instead, she felt like she was standing on solid ground, supported by someone who truly saw her, who truly cared. And for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that she could let go of the past, and embrace whatever future was waiting for her with Antonio by her side. The next few days passed in a blur for Isabella, each moment a blend of excitement and uncertainty. Antonio's presence had become a constant in her life, and the more time she spent with him, the more she realized how much her world was shifting. It was subtle at first, just small moments, like when he would casually brush his hand against hers, or when their eyes would meet across the room, and for a brief moment, it felt like the entire world paused. But then, there were moments when everything felt more intense. The way Antonio seemed to always know when she needed something, whether it was a comforting word or a simple gesture that reminded her she wasn't alone. It was those moments that made her feel like she was truly seen, in a way she had never experienced before. They had been taking their time, building something that felt like trust, like a new beginning for both of them. But Isabella was still haunted by the fear of letting herself truly believe that something beautiful could come from this. She had always kept herself closed off, afraid to let anyone in. But with Antonio, it felt different. As the days wore on, Isabella started to allow herself to believe that maybe this was what she had been waiting for. Antonio wasn't like anyone else she had ever known. He wasn't just a man of power and control. He was kind, he was patient, and most importantly, he cared. One evening, after a long day of work, Isabella was finishing up her shift when she saw Antonio sitting at his usual spot in the restaurant, a slight smile playing on his lips as he watched her. The way he looked at her, like she was the only person in the room, made her feel something she couldn't put into words. There was something about him that made her heart race, but at the same time, it made her feel grounded, like she wasn't alone in a world that often felt overwhelming. As she walked towards him, she could feel her pulse quicken, the nervousness creeping up her spine. She wasn't used to feeling this way, but with him, it was hard to ignore. "You're still here." Antonio's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made her heart flutter. "Yeah," Isabella replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Just finishing up." He nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "I've been thinking," he said, his tone thoughtful. "You don't have to keep doing everything on your own, you know. You don't have to carry the world by yourself." Isabella's chest tightened, and she forced herself to look away for a moment. She had been carrying everything on her own for so long, never asking for help, never allowing anyone to share the weight. But Antonio's words were starting to break down the walls she had built, one by one. "I've always done everything myself," she admitted quietly, the vulnerability in her voice surprising her. "I don't know how to stop." Antonio's gaze softened, and he reached out, gently touching her arm. "You don't have to stop everything at once," he said. "You don't have to figure it all out today. Just know that you're not alone anymore." Isabella looked up at him, the weight of his words sinking in. She had been afraid to trust, afraid to let go of the control she had held onto for so long. But with Antonio, everything felt different. His presence in her life wasn't just a fleeting moment. It was real, it was steady, and it was something she couldn't ignore anymore. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered, the fear in her voice unmistakable. Antonio smiled, a small but reassuring smile that made her heart flutter. "You don't have to know how," he said gently. "You just have to let yourself take the first step. I'll be here for the rest." Isabella's breath caught in her throat as she realized just how much she had been holding on to, how much she had been afraid of losing by opening herself up. But here was Antonio, showing her that she didn't have to be afraid. She didn't have to carry everything alone. "I want to trust you," she said softly, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. But as soon as they left her lips, she knew they were true. Antonio's smile widened, and he stepped closer, closing the distance between them. "I'm not going anywhere, Isabella," he said, his voice full of warmth. "You're not alone in this anymore." For the first time in a long time, Isabella allowed herself to feel the weight of what that meant. She didn't have to be the strong, independent woman who always carried the burden alone. She could let someone else in. She could trust. And in that moment, she realized that letting Antonio in didn't make her weak, it made her human. She was allowed to be vulnerable, allowed to lean on someone, allowed to accept help. The thought was both terrifying and freeing. Antonio reached out, gently cupping her face in his hands, his touch warm and reassuring. "You don't have to be afraid," he whispered. "Not with me." Isabella closed her eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of his words wash over her. For the first time in years, she felt safe. She felt like she could finally breathe, like she didn't have to fight to keep going anymore. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was more to life than survival. There was a chance for something real, something beautiful. With Antonio by her side, she wasn't afraid anymore. As the days turned into weeks, Isabella found herself embracing the changes that had come into her life. She was no longer the woman who had lived in the shadows, pushing herself to the brink of exhaustion just to stay afloat. She wasn't afraid to show vulnerability, to trust someone, and most importantly, to let herself believe that she was worthy of love, care, and support. Antonio had become a constant presence in her life, not as a savior, but as a partner, someone who saw her, understood her, and respected her. It was a feeling she had never known, but one she had come to cherish. The restaurant was busier than usual tonight, but Isabella felt lighter, more at ease than she had in the past. She worked with a new sense of purpose, no longer driven by the need to prove herself. Instead, she worked with a quiet confidence, knowing that she didn't have to shoulder the weight of the world alone. Antonio had made sure of that. He had proven time and time again that he wasn't just there for the good moments. He was there for the tough ones too. And as much as she had been afraid of needing someone, of letting someone else in, she now saw it as a strength, not a weakness. When the evening was winding down, and the last customers were finishing their meals, Isabella found herself looking for Antonio. She had grown used to his presence at the restaurant, but tonight, there was something different in the air. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was about to happen. As she passed through the dining area, she spotted him at his usual table, but this time, he wasn't alone. Her heart skipped a beat as she saw the serious look on his face. He had always been calm, collected, but tonight, there was something in his posture, something that made her feel like this was a conversation they needed to have. As she approached, Antonio stood up, his eyes meeting hers. "We need to talk," he said, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of something deeper. Isabella nodded, her heart racing in her chest. She had no idea what he was about to say, but she knew it was important. They stepped outside into the cool evening air, away from the noise of the restaurant, the city's hum surrounding them in the distance. Antonio turned to face her, his expression serious but not cold. "I've been thinking," he began, "about everything we've talked about what we've built together." Isabella's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the weight of his words, the significance of them. She hadn't expected anything to change, at least not this soon. But as she looked at him, she knew this was a turning point. "I don't want to rush anything," he continued. "But I want you to know that I'm committed to this, to us. I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Isabella's heart swelled with emotions she couldn't quite put into words. She had spent so many years guarding her heart, afraid to open up, afraid of being hurt. But Antonio had broken through those walls, slowly and gently, showing her what it meant to truly trust, to truly connect. "I've never had someone care for me the way you do," Isabella said softly, her voice filled with the truth of her heart. "And I don't know what to do with that. I'm still figuring it out." Antonio stepped closer, his hand reaching for hers. "You don't have to figure it all out at once," he said gently. "We're in this together, one step at a time." Isabella looked up at him, her eyes searching his, trying to understand the depth of his words. She had always been afraid of commitment, of relying on someone else, but Antonio was offering her something different. He wasn't demanding anything from her. He was offering his presence, his support, his heart. And for the first time, she felt like she could truly accept it. "I don't want to be afraid anymore," she said, her voice shaky but filled with conviction. "I don't want to hide behind my walls." Antonio smiled, a smile that made her heart flutter. "Then don't," he said, his voice filled with warmth. "I'm not going anywhere." Isabella took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. She wasn't alone anymore. She didn't have to carry everything by herself. Antonio had given her the freedom to be herself, to trust, and to open her heart. She had never thought this would be possible, but standing here with him, she knew that she was ready to take the next step. "I want this," she said, her voice stronger now. "I want us." Antonio pulled her into his arms, holding her close, and for the first time, Isabella felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. They weren't perfect, and life wouldn't always be easy, but they had each other. And that was enough. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in her life, Isabella felt ready to face it, not alone, but with Antonio by her side. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living, and that was more than enough. Get lost in one of the most captivating romance stories that take you through unexpected twists and turns. A powerful mafia boss and an ordinary woman find themselves drawn together in a story filled with emotion, vulnerability, and deep connection. This romance story goes beyond the typical love tale, as it explores the healing power of trust and the transformation that comes with letting someone into your heart. From a hardworking woman who has spent her life in survival mode to a man who shows her that she deserves more, this romance story will have you hooked from start to finish. As the two characters navigate their feelings, they discover the beauty of relying on each other, learning that love is not just about control, but about mutual respect and support. The journey of self-discovery and love in this romance story will leave you believing in the possibility of change and second chances. Experience a love story that teaches us about the importance of letting go, trusting, and finding love in the most unexpected places. These romance stories will stay with you long after the last word, reminding us that sometimes the greatest love stories are the ones that help us heal and grow. Don't miss out on this unforgettable romance story that will make you believe in love all over again.